On the last day of August, 1864, there was a battle between Union and Confederate forces in the small town of Jonesboro, 20 miles south of Atlanta. It wasn't the largest battle in the Civil War, nor the bloodiest, but it was one of the most important. Here's why. In the spring of 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman ordered his army to march south into Georgia, and the Confederates fought them every step of the way. They battled in Dalton and Resaca, in Allatoona and Kennesaw Mountain, and all the while Sherman had one objective, and the rebels knew it. Atlanta, a small town by today's standards, about 20,000 people, but there were factories here and 3 major rail lines. That's why Sherman wanted it. From Atlanta came the guns and ammunition and uniforms and medicine and food that kept alive the struggling Confederate army. By August, the city was under siege and nearly surrounded. There was only one supply line still open. To the south, the Macon and Western Railroad in Jonesboro. The Federal troops had 70,000 men, the rebels only about 20,000 on the first day of the Battle of Jonesboro. On the second day, the Confederates had only half that many. They were outnumbered 6-1.
And you know, the battle lasted all day. The Confederates fighting back, attack after attack after attack. Men began to pile on top of men. The wounded on the bottom are being laid on by a dead man, another wounded man, stacking them, as they say, like cordwood, like a stack of firewood beside your house in the wintertime. So they laid on top of each other till it was almost impossible to move. History records again and again where the soldiers couldn't even walk for the bodies in different battles, and this was one of them.
We got him on the run!
On the second day, the Confederates fought behind the protection of a trench, and they made the advancing Federals pay for every foot of ground. In the Civil War, fighting was brutal and life was hard, both in battle and before in camp. The men wouldn't see their families for months or even years. Their food was often rotten and covered with flies. The hardtack biscuit issued to the men was tough enough to stop a bullet, and the bullets were huge. They were made of soft lead that would shatter a bone into a dozen pieces. Often, if you were wounded, that meant amputation.
And they amputated a lot. When litter bearers would go out into battlefields looking for wounded men, if you were shot anywhere in the torso, you were called mortally wounded, which meant you were going to die. And so they'd look for soldiers who were shot in either the arm or the leg. And they would bring those back to the surgeon because the surgeon had a pretty good chance of saving them. A soldier had a 1 in 10 chance of surviving without an amputation. They had a 7 in 10 chance surviving with one, which is why amputations were so common.
But the worst enemy wasn't bullets. It was bacteria, germs. The men lived outdoors. There were no bathrooms, no clean drinking water. Oftentimes, men didn't stop to wash their hands, their dishes, their clothes, or themselves.
During the Civil War, far more men died of disease and illness and sickness than were ever killed by a bullet or a cannon or a bayonet.
In fact, in the Civil War, about 200,000 men were killed in battle, but almost 400,000 Union and rebel soldiers died of disease. Well, back to the Battle of Jonesboro. By the end of the second day, the outnumbered Confederates were overrun by Federal troops, and the battle ended at nightfall. The Confederates were forced to move back. In fact, the whole Confederate army had to be evacuated from the city of Atlanta because they were now surrounded and their supplies were cut off. The next day, General Sherman moved into the city. Atlanta, its factories, its warehouses, and railroads lost to the Union Army. It was September 1864, an election year, and many believed that if Atlanta had not fallen, Abraham Lincoln would not have been elected to his second term as president. And today, instead of a United States, there would be 2 countries, a North and a South. After the Battle of Jonesboro, some of the surviving Confederates, under the command of General Patrick Cleburne, went north to Nashville to fight their last fight. Claiborne was Irish, and after a battle, it was his custom to have his bagpipers play Amazing Grace as a kind of funeral prayer for the men who died. In that last battle, south of Nashville, after the fall of Atlanta, again the Confederates were outnumbered. They knew that they were going to lose, that many would die. But they followed orders. They fought anyway.
But this morning, as they're ordered to drive the Yankees from the field, as they marched out on the field through the mist, the Yankees said, "We saw the flag, the blue and white flag of Claiborne's men." And he said, "We knew we were in for a fight." And he said, but there was something else that we just couldn't quite distinguish. Something there. As they moved closer, they began to hear it. First subconsciously and then in their ear, a whine, a whining noise. As they moved closer, they recognized it. It was the bagpipes of Claiborne's men. And this is what made their hair stand on end. When they recognized the tune, it was Claiborne's band. They were marching out on the field with bayonets ready to drive the Federals' overwhelming numbers from the field as they were ordered. But the bagpipes were playing Amazing Grace. And the Federals said our hair stood on the backs of our necks because we knew then that they were marching out to their own funeral dirge. And these men were ready to die.
And they did. Almost 7,000 Confederates were killed or wounded. A month later, the Army disbanded, and many of the men just went back home. And 5 months later, General Lee surrendered in a courthouse in the small town of Appomattox. The bloodiest war in our history was over.